In the unforgiving heart of the American West, some men are measured by the gold in their pockets or the speed of their draw. But one man was measured by his shadow alone, a shadow that stretched so long and wide it could swallow a whole town in fear. They called him Goliath, a giant of a man with hands that could crush rock and a sput shrouded in dark whispers. Every woman in Redemption Ridge shuddered at the thought of being his bride. Every woman, that is, until one. This is the story of the one woman who dared to look past the monster and see the man discovering a love as vast and wild as the frontier itself. The Montana Territory in 1888 was a land that broke people. It was a sprawling, untamed canvas of jagged mountains, endless plains and skies so big they could make a man feel like an ant crawling on God's floor. Towns like Redemption Ridge were just small, stubborn smudges on that canvas, clinging to life by a thread of grit and desperation. The dust of the high plains was an ingredient in every meal, a film on every window, and a constant grit in the eye. It was a place where legends were born, not from heroic deeds but from survival. And in Redemption Ridge there was no legend bigger or more feared than Caleb Stone. Nobody called him Caleb. To the townsfolk he was simply Goliath. The name fit. Caleb stood a hair's breadth from 7 feet tall, with a breadth of shoulder that made doorways seem like mouse holes. His hands, thick with calluses and corded with muscle, looked like they were carved from ancient oak. When he rode his colossal Shire horse, Samson, into town for supplies, once a month, conversations would wither and die in the street. Mothers would pull their children close, and the men at the saloon would watch him from the corners of their eyes, their bravado curdling into a quiet, watchful unease. His face framed by a thick, untamed beard and a mane of dark hair was a landscape of harsh angles and old sorrows. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled people. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they seemed to hold the cold, lonely light of a distant star. They didn't look at you. They looked through you as if weighing a soul and finding it wanting. The stories about him were as wild and vast as the territory itself. Some said he'd killed a man with a single punch over a card game in a mining camp up north. Others whispered he'd wrestled a grizzly bear and won, the deep scars on his forearms being the only proof. The most persistent rumor was that he had a temper as violent and unpredictable as a summer thunderstorm, and that he had retreated to his isolated ranch deep in the foothills of the Wolf Mountains to keep his rage from consuming the world. His ranch was as intimidating as the man himself. It was a fortress of solitude, built with thick, hand-hewn logs, nestled in a valley that was his and his alone. He had the best land, the strongest stock, and the deepest well in the county. Yet no one dared to become his neighbor. He worked his land from sunup to sundown with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. He needed no ranch hands. He did the work of 5 men himself, his powerful form a moving silhouette against the dawn and the dusk. But the work couldn't fill the silence. The silence in that valley was a living thing, a constant companion that pressed in on him when the sweat of the day had cooled and the moon rose over the peaks. It was in that crushing silence that Caleb Stone the Goliath felt the one thing he couldn't fight with his bare hands, a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. He was 32 years old and had never known the gentle touch of a woman, the sound of shared laughter in his home, or the simple comfort of a companionable silence. He needed a wife. The thought was a desperate, foolish prayer at first, but it grew into a stark necessity. His home was a shell, not a home. He needed someone to manage the house, to tend a garden, to bring a spark of life to the cold stone hearth. He needed a partner. One crisp autumn day, he rode into Redemption Ridge, tied Samson to the hitching post outside the mercantile, and did the unthinkable. He tacked a notice to the public board, his huge hand dwarfing the small hammer and nail. The notice was written in surprisingly neat, careful script on a piece of clean paper. Wife wanted. Seeking a woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to live and work on a remote ranch. Will be provided with a secure home protection and a loyal husband. All needs met. Inquire for details. C. Stone, Wolf Valley Ranch. The silence that followed him out of town was soon replaced by a wave of incredulous laughter and scorn. The notice became the town's biggest joke. The cowboys at the saloon would read it aloud in booming, mocking voices. "A loyal husband," bellowed a ranch hand named Pete Dawson, slapping his thigh. "More like a loyal beast of burden, who'd want to be chained to that monster." "I hear he eats his meat raw," another added to a chorus of laughter. The women of the town were even more cutting. Young Clara May, the blacksmith's daughter, shuddered theatrically. "I'd sooner marry a rattlesnake. At least a snake gives you a warning before it strikes." Even the town's more desperate widows and spinsters shook their heads. To them, marrying Caleb Stone wasn't a solution to their problems. It was a death sentence. To be trapped in that remote valley with a man of his size and reputation was a fate worse than poverty or loneliness. The notice stayed on the board, collecting dust, a public monument to the giant's folly. It was into this simmering pot of gossip and fear that Miss Abigail Finch arrived. She came on the afternoon stagecoach, a solitary figure in a plain grey travelling dress, her worldly possessions contained in a single battered trunk. She was not a beauty in the conventional sense. Her face was too thin, her mouth too wide, and her hazel eyes held a weariness that spoke of a life already marked by loss. She was slight of build, almost bird-like, and seemed as if a strong gust of wind might carry her away. But beneath that fragile exterior was a spine forged in the furnaces of hardship. Orphaned by a cholera outbreak in Ohio, Abigail had come west to live with her only living relative, her mother's brother, Silas Croft. Silas was the town's bookkeeper and tailor, a man whose gentle nature and persistent cough made him ill-suited for the harsh realities of the frontier. Abigail had hoped for a new beginning, a place to quietly mend her broken heart and build a new life. What she found was a town gripped by the story of the giant in the mountains, and an uncle whose financial troubles were far worse than he had let on in his letters. Silas, she quickly learned, was deeply in debt, and the man who held that debt was the most powerful and unscrupulous man in Redemption Ridge, Sterling Moss. Sterling owned the saloon, the hotel, and held the mortgage on half the businesses in town, including Silas Croft's small tailor shop. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, with silver-threaded hair, a perfectly trimmed moustache, and eyes that missed nothing. He dressed in fine suits from back east, and carried an air of untouchable authority. When he saw Abigail for the first time, his eyes lit with a possessive gleam that made her skin crawl. Abigail took on work as a seamstress, helping her uncle and trying to stave off the inevitable. She was quiet, hard-working, and kept to herself. But she couldn't avoid the town's talk, and the story of Caleb Stone and his public notice was everywhere. She'd see the notice every time she went to the mercantile. Unlike the others, she didn't laugh. She felt a strange, unexpected pang of pity for the author of those neat, lonely words. She imagined a man so isolated He had to advertise for a companion, and it struck her as a tragedy, not a joke. She saw his name, C. Stone, and for a moment she wondered what the C stood for. For the first time, she gave the monster a human initial. Her quiet life was shattered one evening when Sterling Moss paid a visit to the tailor shop. Her uncle was out making a delivery. Moss didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Your uncle's accounts are long past due. I've been a patient man, but my patience has its limits." "We're doing our best, Mr. Moss," Abigail replied, her hands clutching the fabric she was hemming. "We'll have the money soon." Moss stepped closer, invading her personal space. He trailed a finger along her jawline. "Perhaps we can come to a different sort of arrangement. A woman as lovely as you shouldn't be wasting away in a dusty shop. I could provide you with a very comfortable life." Abigail jerked her head back, her eyes flashing with anger. "I am not for sale, Mr. Moss." His smile turned cold. "That's a pity, because this shop, this roof over your head most certainly is. I own it, and I can have you and your sickly uncle out on the street by morning. Think about my offer." He tipped his hat and left, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the coming winter. Panic seized Abigail. He had them trapped. They had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The law in Redemption Ridge was whatever Sterling Moss said it was. She saw her future stretching before her, either submit to that vile man, or be cast out into the wilderness with a sick old man to care for. Both paths led to ruin. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the moon cast long shadows across the silent street. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a third path, and then an image floated into her mind, a piece of paper tacked to a public board with neat, careful script. "Will be provided with a secure home protection and a loyal husband." The words echoed in her head. Protection. A secure home. It was a mad, terrifying thought, an idea born of pure desperation. The town saw a monster. The town saw a joke. But Abigail, cornered and with nothing left to lose, saw a chance. A terrifying, monstrous long shot of a chance. The next morning, she rose before dawn. She left a note for her uncle, telling him only that she was going to secure their future. With a small bundle of bread and a canteen of water, she walked out of town, her face set with grim determination, and took the path that led toward the Wolf Mountains. She was going to see the giant. She was going to offer herself as a solution to his problem, in the desperate hope that he might be the solution to hers. The walk to Wolf Valley was a pilgrimage of fear. The path out of town quickly dwindled from a wide, wagon-rutted road to a narrow, winding track that climbed steadily into the foothills. The friendly chatter of Redemption Ridge faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine trees and the unsettling cry of a distant hawk. With every step, Abigail felt as though she were leaving the known world behind and venturing into the pages of a dark fairy tale. The mountains loomed larger, their grey peaks scraping against the pale blue sky. This was his domain, the giant's kingdom, and she was an intruder. The stories the townsfolk told played on a loop in her mind. Killed a man with a single punch, wrestled a grizzly, a temper like a thunderstorm. Her hands, tucked into the pockets of her worn cloak, were slick with nervous sweat. What was she thinking? This was suicide. She should turn back, face Sterling Moss, and beg for more time. But the memory of his cold, possessive touch on her skin spurred her onward. The fear of the known was, for the moment, greater than the fear of the unknown. After nearly 3 hours of walking, the trail opened into a wide, secluded valley. The sight stole her breath away momentarily, chasing the fear from her heart. It was beautiful. A clear, fast-running creek snaked through a meadow of tall, golden grass. A herd of fat, healthy-looking cattle grazed peacefully, and in the center of it all, nestled against a backdrop of dark green forest, stood the house. It was large, yes, but it wasn't the monstrous fortress she had imagined. It was a simple, sturdy log cabin, built with undeniable skill. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and a pen nearby held several chickens. There was a well-tended vegetable patch now mostly harvested for the winter, and a small corral where the largest horse she had ever seen stood swishing its tail. It was a place of solitude, certainly, but it didn't feel evil. It felt quiet. Her courage faltered. Now that she was here, the sheer audacity of her plan seemed insane. As she stood hesitating at the edge of the tree line, the cabin door opened. Caleb Stone emerged, and the scale of the valley suddenly seemed to shrink. He was bigger than the stories. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was unnerving in a man of his size. He wore simple denim trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms thick as tree limbs and crisscrossed with the white, puckered lines of old scars. He hadn't seen her. He walked to the woodpile, picked up an axe, and with a single, seemingly effortless swing, split a large log in two. The sharp crack echoed through the valley. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped out of the cover of the trees and began to walk across the meadow toward the house. The crunch of her boots on the dry grass must have alerted him. He stopped the axe held loosely in one hand and turned his head. His pale blue eyes fixed on her, and for a long moment he was perfectly still, like a great mountain cat that had spotted a fawn. He wasn't scowling as she'd expected. His expression was one of pure, unguarded surprise. It was clear that visitors were a rare, almost unheard of event. As she drew closer, the sheer physical reality of him was overwhelming. She had to crane her neck to look up at his face. She stopped about 20 feet away, her throat suddenly dry. "Mr. Stone." Her voice was a reedy whisper, almost lost in the vastness of the valley. He didn't answer immediately. He just watched her, his gaze intense and searching. She could see the confusion in his eyes, warring with a deep, ingrained suspicion. Finally, he gave a curt, single nod. His voice, when it came, was a low, rumbling bass, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "What do you want?" It wasn't a welcoming question. It was a demand, a challenge. "State your business and be gone." Abigail swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "My name is Abigail Finch. I saw your notice in town." A flicker of something annoyance, embarrassment crossed his face. He looked away from her toward the distant mountains. "The notice is a mistake. Take yourself home, miss." "No," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. The sting of his dismissal hardened her resolve. "I'm not here to mock you, Mr. Stone. I'm here to answer it." That got his attention. He turned his head back so sharply that she flinched. His eyes narrowed, studying her, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. He took in her slight frame, her plain dress, her determined but undoubtedly frightened face. The corner of his mouth twitched, but not in a smile. "This is some kind of joke," he growled. "Did Dawson and his boys put you up to this? Did Moss pay you to come out here and make a fool of me?" "No. No one knows I'm here," she insisted, taking a half step forward. This is my own decision. I am a woman of good character. I am a hard worker. I can cook and clean and sew, and I know how to run a household. I believe I meet the qualifications you listed." He let out a short, harsh sound that might have been a laugh, but it held no humor. "And why in God's name would a woman like you want to marry me?" He gestured to himself with the axe, a motion that was both self-deprecating and threatening. "Have you seen me? Do you know what they say about me? I know you are a man in need of a wife." Abigail said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I am a woman in need of a husband. I am in a desperate situation, Mr. Stone. I need the security and protection you offered." His suspicion deepened. What kind of desperate situation? She hesitated. She couldn't bring herself to lay her shame and her uncle's vulnerability bare before this stranger. "It is a private matter, but it is dire. I am not seeking romance or riches. I am seeking a partnership, a bargain. You provide me with a home and safety, and I will be the wife you require. I will run your house, cook your meals, and I will not be a burden. It would be a business arrangement." Caleb stared at her for what felt like an eternity. He was trying to see the angle, the trick. He had lived a life where every interaction with the world was a potential threat, a prelude to mockery or violence. The idea of a woman, any woman willingly coming to his doorstep, was beyond his comprehension. And yet, there was something in her eyes. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't greed. It was a fierce, desperate honesty that resonated with his own profound loneliness. He saw a fellow creature trapped and looking for a way out. He had expected to live out his days in this valley alone. He had tacked up that notice in a moment of weakness, a final futile gesture against the crushing silence. He never believed anyone would answer it. And now here was this small, trembling woman offering him a deal that was as insane as it was tempting. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he said, his voice softer now, almost a warning. "This life is hard. It's lonely. I am not an easy man." "My life has not been easy either, Mr. Stone," she replied quietly. "And my other options are harder still. I am not afraid of loneliness. I am afraid of other things." He leaned the axe against the woodpile and crossed his massive arms over his chest. The posture was defensive, but it also felt like he was holding himself in containing some immense force. "You come into my valley. You offer to marry a man you don't know, a man the whole world calls a monster. You won't tell me why. You expect me to just agree. I expect you to recognize that my offer is as genuine as your need." She countered, her courage surging. "You wrote that notice for a reason. I am the answer to it. Whether you choose to accept that answer is up to you." She stood her ground, unflinching, under his intense scrutiny. She had laid her only card on the table. There was nothing left to do but wait for him to play his. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak and the wind. He was seeing past her worn dress and tired face. He was seeing the steel in her spine, and perhaps for the first time, in a very long time, he felt a flicker of something other than loneliness or suspicion. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling hope. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and heavy with the weight of the decision. "If we do this, there's no going back. The preacher in town, Reverend Michael, he'll do it. But once it's done, it's done. You would be my wife. This would be your home. Your life would be here, with me." Abigail's breath hitched. He was agreeing. The terrifying, impossible plan was working. "I understand," she whispered. "We'll be married tomorrow," he said, as if sealing a cattle deal. "Go back to town. Get whatever things you need. Be at the preacher's house at noon. I'll meet you there." Without another word, he turned, picked up his axe, and swung it with ferocious force, cleaving another log in two. It was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Abigail stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling. Then she turned and walked away, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She didn't look back. As she re-entered the shadows of the forest path, she wasn't sure if she was walking toward her salvation or her doom. She had made her desperate bargain. Now she would have to live with it. Back in the valley, Caleb Stone stopped his work. He watched the spot where she had disappeared into the trees. He raised a hand and touched his own rough, bearded cheek, a gesture of profound disbelief. A wife. He was going to have a wife. Her name was Abigail Finch, and he had no idea what to do. The wedding was a hollow, hurried affair that clung to the memory like a ghost. It took place in the cramped, dusty parlor of Reverend Michael's small house. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. Abigail wore the same plain grey dress she had arrived in, her face pale and her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. Caleb stood beside her, a hulking, uncomfortable presence in a clean but ill-fitting shirt. He seemed to take up all the air in the room, his shoulders brushing the doorframe as he entered. The only witnesses were the Reverend's wife, a portly, nervous woman named Martha, who kept darting sympathetic glances at Abigail and Abigail's Uncle Silas Croft. Silas had been utterly bewildered when Abigail returned the previous evening and announced her intentions. He had protested, his voice weak and raspy, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear for her and shame for his own inability to protect her. But Abigail had been resolute. "It is the only way, Uncle Silas," she had said, and the finality in her tone had silenced him. Now he stood hunched in a corner, looking small and defeated, twisting his hat in his hands. Reverend Michael, a thin man with kind but worried eyes, rushed through the vows as if eager to get the strangeness over with. When he pronounced them, man and wife, there was no celebratory kiss, no joyful exclamation. There was only a thick, suffocating silence. Caleb simply grunted, produced a worn leather pouch, and paid the Reverend a sum that made the preacher's eyes widen. It was a transaction, nothing more. Outside the town was already buzzing. News of the wedding had spread like wildfire. Faces peered from behind curtains as Caleb helped Abigail onto the seat of his large wagon, which was loaded with her single trunk. He moved with a stiff, awkward gentleness, his huge hands barely brushing her arm, as if he were afraid she might break. As they rode out of Redemption Ridge, the stares of the townsfolk felt like physical blows. Abigail kept her chin high and her eyes fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the heat of their scorn and morbid curiosity. They were now Mr. and Mrs. Stone, the giant and his tiny, mad bride. The journey back to Wolf Valley was made in near-complete silence. The silence was different now. Before it had been the silence of strangers. Now it was the heavy, expectant silence of a husband and wife who were strangers still. The chasm between them seemed as wet and deep as the valley itself. When they arrived at the ranch, Caleb carried her trunk into the house as if it weighed nothing. He set it down in the main room, which served as a kitchen, dining room, and living space. It was scrupulously clean, but starkly masculine. A large wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace, cold and black, dominated one wall. Shelves held a few tin plates, mugs, and a small, well-ordered pantry of supplies. There was no softness, no color, no hint of comfort. "The bedroom is through there," Caleb said, gesturing with his head toward a closed door. It was my parents' room. It's yours now." Abigail looked at the door, then back at him. "And you? There's another room. Smaller. In the back. It's where I sleep." He shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. The implication was clear. He had no intention of sharing a bed with her. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made her dizzy, washed over Abigail. Whatever this marriage was, it was not going to be a violation. It was as she had proposed a bargain. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave another one of his curt nods and retreated out the door back to the safety of his work and the vastness of the valley. Left alone in the quiet house, Abigail finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She had done it. She was safe from Sterling Moss. She had a roof over her head. But as she looked around the Spartan room, a profound sense of isolation settled over her. She had traded one prison for another, more spacious but perhaps even lonelier one. The first days were a careful, silent dance of avoidance. Abigail threw herself into making the house a home. She unpacked her trunk, placing the few meager possessions she owned, a tarnished silver locket with pictures of her parents, a handful of books, a sewing kit on a small nightstand in her room. The bedroom was as stark as the rest of the house, dominated by a large, sturdy bed frame and a simple wardrobe. It smelled of dust and disuse. She spent hours scrubbing, polishing, and airing the place out. She found a stash of old flour sacks, and with the skill of a seasoned seamstress, began turning them into curtains for the windows. She organized the pantry, took stock of their supplies, and started a list for their next trip to town. She cooked. The first meal she made was a simple stew, which they ate in complete silence at the big table, sitting at opposite ends like two monarchs from warring nations. Caleb ate with a ferocious appetite, his eyes never leaving his plate. When he was finished, he stood up, scraped his plate clean, and said, "Good stew." It was the most he had said to her since the wedding. Slowly, tentatively, Abigail began to notice things. Small details that didn't fit the town's narrative of a mindless beast. One evening she saw him through the window standing by the corral with his giant horse, Samson. He was stroking the horse's neck and speaking to it, his deep voice a soft, gentle rumble. There was a tenderness in his touch and his tone that was startling. Another day, while sweeping out his small room in the back, a space barely large enough for a cot and a crate that served as a table, she found a book tucked under his pillow. It was a thin, worn volume of poetry by John Keats. The cover was nearly worn away, and the pages were soft with use. The thought of this massive, fearsome man reading romantic poetry by candlelight was so incongruous, so profoundly unexpected, that she sat on the edge of his cot for a long moment, the book in her hands, her perception of him shifting like sand. The most poignant discovery was a small fenced-off area behind the house beneath a solitary pine tree. In it was a single well-tended grave marked by a simple wooden cross. The name carved into it read, "Elizabeth Stone, a beloved mother." There were no weeds around the grave, and a small cluster of hardy mountain wildflowers grew at its base, clearly planted and cared for by hand. He wasn't just a monster born of the wilderness. He was a son who had loved his mother. Meanwhile, in Redemption Ridge, Sterling Moss was not pleased. He had considered Abigail Finch his for the taking. The news of her marriage to the town's pariah was a personal and public insult. He had been outmaneuvered by a woman he'd considered helpless, and a man he considered a savage. It was an affront to his pride and his power. His retribution was subtle at first. On Caleb's next trip to town for supplies with Abigail, sitting silently beside him on the wagon seat. The whispers were louder, the stares more hostile. The mercantile owner, a man named Henderson, who was in Moss's pocket, overcharged Caleb for flour and salt. Pete Dawson and his cronies made lewd, snickering comments, just loud enough for Abigail to hear as she walked by. "Wonder if the giant knows what to do with a real lady," Dawson sneered. "Or does she have to draw him a map?" Abigail's face burned with humiliation, but Caleb seemed not to hear. He simply loaded their supplies, his expression unreadable, and drove the wagon out of town. But Abigail saw the way his hands tightened on the reins, the knuckles turning white. He heard. He just chose to endure it in stony silence. The harassment escalated. A week later, Caleb discovered that a section of his fence had been cut and a dozen of his best cattle were missing. He spent 2 days tracking them, finally finding them scattered miles away. But 3 were lost for good. He never said who he thought was responsible, but a grim, hard light had entered his eyes. He started carrying his rifle with him whenever he rode the fence line. The tension coiled in the small cabin. It was an unspoken thing between them, this external threat that pressed in on their fragile, silent arrangement. The shared danger became a strange, invisible thread connecting them. One evening, as Abigail was mending one of Caleb's shirts, it was like mending a sail. He came inside his face, dark as a thunderhead. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. Abigail put down her sewing, her heart beginning to race. "This ain't working," he said, not looking at her. He paced the length of the room, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. "Moss is pushing. He'll keep pushing. He's trying to get at me through you. I thought having you here, making this a proper marriage, might make things better. But it's making it worse. You're in more danger here with me than you were in town." He stopped and finally looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a tormented frustration. "I can take you back. We can say it was a mistake. The Reverend can undo it." Abigail stared at him. Go back. Back to her terrified uncle. Back to being at the mercy of Sterling Moss. The man who had caused this problem was now offering to send her back into its jaws. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Caleb looked stunned. "No. Why not? Did you not hear me? He's going to get you hurt, Abigail." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange and wonderful in his deep voice. It made her brave. "And what would happen to me if I went back?" she countered, standing up. "Mr. Moss would have me right where he wants me. My uncle would be on the street. Is that the kind of safety you think I should return to? You promised me protection, Mr. Stone. Are you now telling me you are unable to provide it?" It was a direct challenge, a questioning of his strength and his word. It hit him harder than any physical blow. His jaw clenched. "I can protect you." He growled his voice, a low threat. "Then protect me here," she shot back. "This is my home now. You made that promise and I made mine. I am your wife. I will not be scared off by that. That snake in a fancy suit. And I will not have you thinking that I am a burden or a mistake." She stood before him, small and defiant, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. For the first time, someone was not just standing up to him, but standing up for him, for them. In that moment, She ceased to be part of a bargain. She became an ally, his partner. A slow, profound change occurred in Caleb's expression. The frustration and anger drained away, replaced by a look of stunned admiration. He saw past the frightened woman he'd made a deal with and saw the warrior beneath. "All right, Abigail," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "All right, we stay, we fight." That night, the silence at the dinner table was different again. It was no longer empty or awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. It was the silence of two soldiers in a trench, waiting for the battle to begin, knowing they were on the same side. The uneasy alliance was beginning to forge itself into something stronger, something that might, with time and pressure, become unbreakable. The first snows of winter draped the valley in a quiet blanket of white, shrinking the world until the cabin became its sole focal point. The fragile truce between Caleb and Abigail, forged in their shared defiance of sterling moss, was about to be tested by the full force of a Montana winter. A blizzard descended from the north, not as a gentle flurry, but as a 3-day siege of screaming wind and blinding snow. The world beyond their windows disappeared into a churning white abyss, trapping them completely. The storm forced an intimacy that months of quiet coexistence had not. The first day was a battle against the elements. Caleb, a bulwark against the gale, fought for hours to secure the livestock in the barn, his massive form coated in a sheath of ice when he finally stumbled back inside. Abigail was ready. A fire roared in the hearth, and the scent of hot coffee and stew filled the small space. As she helped him out of his frozen coat, her fingers brushed the ice from his beard, a fleeting, accidental touch against his skin. Their eyes met, and in the charged silence, a spark of awareness ignited, startling both of them. He was not just her protector, he was a man. She was not just a housekeeper, she was a woman. Caleb pulled back, a flush of color rising on his raw cheeks as he turned toward the fire. But the barrier had been breached. Over the next 3 days, trapped by the howling gale, the walls between them crumbled. The silence, once a tool of avoidance, now became a space for conversation. They talked as the storm raged, their voices weaving a tapestry of their past lives. Abigail spoke of Ohio, of the parents she missed, and the books that had been her only companions. She revealed a quick, surprising wit that coaxed a rare, genuine smile from Caleb, a smile that transformed his harsh features and revealed a glimpse of the man beneath the giant. He in turn began to share pieces of himself. He spoke of his mother Elizabeth, a woman who had loved wild flowers and who had taught her giant son to read poetry. He spoke of her grave behind the cabin, the one he so carefully tended. On the third and final night of the blizzard, with the wind rattling the very logs of the cabin, the last of their defenses gave way. Sitting in the warm glow of the fire, Abigail took a deep breath. "You never truly knew why I came here," she said softly, her gaze on the flames. "Why I was so desperate." She told him everything. She spoke of her uncle's debt and of Sterling Moss's predatory ultimatum, laying the truth of her situation bare. She spoke not with self-pity, but with the simple, stark honesty of a survivor. Caleb listened, his body rigid, his hands clenching into fists so tight his knuckles were white. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest when she finished. "When the snow clears," he vowed, his voice deadly quiet, "I will go to town and I will kill him." "No, Caleb," she said, and her voice was firm. She reached out, placing her small hand over his massive clenched fist. "That is what he wants. He wants you to become the monster of his stories. It would give him the excuse he needs to see you hanged. We cannot win by becoming what he accuses you of being." Her touch and the unwavering strength in her eyes seemed to drain the violent rage from him. His great fist slowly uncurled beneath her hand, his fingers gently brushing hers. A profound, weary sadness replaced the anger in his eyes. "They have always seen a monster," he said, his voice rough with a decade of buried pain. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a torment that made her heart ache. "You want to know the truth of the stories?" "The man I killed." Abigail leaned forward, her expression full of a trust he had never known. "Tell me." The story, held in silence for so long, spilled from him in a raw, broken torrent. He was barely a man of 20, working a silver mine in the Rockies, his unnatural size and strength exploited by a cruel foreman. The other miners feared him, all except one, a scrawny 17-year-old boy named Billy Ray Cobb, who saw not a monster, but a marvel. "He was just a lonely kid," Caleb whispered, his eyes distant, seeing a ghost in the firelight. "Like me." He recounted the fatal day in the unstable tunnel, the foreman's reckless order. He told her how he'd tried to stop Billy Ray from following him in, how he'd felt the timbers groan and had thrown the boy back towards the entrance, screaming at him to run. The roof came down. Caleb's voice cracked. He stumbled. "A beam." It caught him. I dug myself out with my hands, but he was gone. The foreman, to save himself, had immediately twisted the tragedy, telling the enraged camp that Caleb, in a fit of giant's rage, had caused the collapse and murdered the boy. "They came for me with guns," he said, squeezing his eyes shut against the memory. "A mob. I ran. I never stopped running. I came here and built my walls, figuring it was better to be feared in isolation than to be hunted by their hate." The confession hung in the air, heavy and heartbreaking. Abigail finally understood the depth of his solitude, the crushing weight of the unjust guilt he carried. He was not a monster. He was a man frozen in time by a moment of tragedy, a protector who believed he had failed. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She moved from her chair to kneel on the hearthrug before him, taking both of his large, scarred hands in hers. "Caleb," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but fierce with conviction. "Listen to me. That was not your fault. You tried to save him. You did everything you could. You were not his killer. You were trying to be his hero." He shook his head, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on his cheek. "I should have been stronger." "You were a boy," she insisted, squeezing his hands. "A boy who has carried a man's burden for far too long. You are not the man they whisper about. You have the kindest, gentlest heart I have ever known." He looked up at her, and in her tear-filled eyes, he saw not pity but absolution. He saw unwavering belief. He saw a reflection of himself, not as a monster, but as a man worthy of love and defense. A decade of loneliness, guilt, and grief shattered within him. He leaned forward, his movements filled with a reverence that was almost painful. He cupped her face in his immense hands, his thumbs gently wiping her tears away. The blizzard howled outside, a forgotten echo, for the only storm that mattered now was the one breaking within their hearts. He lowered his head and kissed his wife. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition of shared sorrow and silent promise. It was the sealing of a bond forged in desperation, tested by adversity, and now finally baptized in love. When it ended, the bargain was gone forever. They were no longer allies in a pact of convenience. They were Caleb and Abigail, and they would face the world together. The end of the blizzard brought a profound thaw, not just to the snow-covered valley, but to the frozen landscape between Caleb and Abigail. The cabin, once a bastion of silence and solitude, now echoed with the quiet sounds of a shared life. A low hum from Abigail as she baked a soft question from Caleb about a stray calf. A shared glance across the dinner table that spoke volumes. The bargain had dissolved in the heat of the firelight, confessions replaced by the tender shoots of a love neither had ever expected to find. This newfound peace was a fragile, precious thing, a warm hearth in a cold, hard world. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. One afternoon, a week after the storm had cleared, the peace was shattered by the frantic barking of their dog, Patch. Abigail looked up from the garden patch she was preparing for spring, her heart seizing in her chest. 3 riders were cutting across the meadow, heading directly for the cabin. Sterling Moss sat arrogantly in the lead, his familiar thugs Pete Dawson and another hard-faced man flanking him like vultures. Caleb was on the far side of the valley, checking a remote section of fence. He was too far away to see too far to hear a shout. For a terrifying moment, the old Abigail, the frightened, cornered woman from Redemption Ridge, surfaced. Her first instinct was to run to bar the door and hide, but the memory of Caleb's pained confession and the feel of his gentle kiss burned away the fear. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was the mistress of this home. With a newfound icy resolve, she walked back inside the cabin. Her hands, surprisingly steady, took Caleb's heavy hunting rifle from its place on the wall. She checked the load, the familiar weight of the weapon a strange comfort. She was not a killer, but she would not be a coward. Stepping out onto the porch, she held the rifle across her body and waited a small, unmoving figure against the vastness of the land. Moss pulled his horse to a halt, a cruel, amused smirk playing on his lips as he dismounted. "Well now," he drawled, his eyes raking over her with predatory confidence. "The little mouse is playing with the farmer's gun. Where is your monstrous keeper, Mrs. Stone?" "My husband is occupied," Abigail stated, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "You are not welcome here, Mr. Moss. Leave now." Moss let out a short, ugly laugh. "I think not. I've grown tired of this game, Abigail. A woman like you doesn't belong in a hovel with a beast. You belong with a man of power. I'm here to take you with me." He started toward the steps, his confidence absolute. "Put the gun down. You don't have the nerve." "Try me," Abigail said, and in one smooth motion, she raised the rifle to her shoulder, the iron sight lining up perfectly with the center of Sterling Moss's chest. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. His men, unnerved, shifted their hands toward their pistols. The tense tableau was broken by a low voice that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. "She told you to leave." Caleb had emerged from the forest line as silent as a hunting panther. He hadn't come from the direction of the fence. He must have seen them and circled around, using the land as his ally. He held his own rifle loosely in one hand, but it was the look on his face that stopped every heart. It was not the face of a wild beast. It was a mask of utter chilling calm. His pale eyes, however, burned with a cold fire that was more frightening than any shout of rage. Moss and his men, spun around, their bravado instantly curdling into raw fear. "Stone," Moss spat, trying to regain his composure. "Finally came out of hiding. I was just having a word with your wife. In fact, I came to discuss a debt. Not the piddling one her uncle owes, the one you owe. The one for that boy you murdered. Billy Ray Cobb." It was his final, most venomous arrow shot, with the intent to provoke the very eruption of violence he could then use against Caleb. He wanted the monster. Caleb's expression didn't change, but a deep stillness fell over him. He slowly, deliberately leaned his rifle against the trunk of a nearby pine. He was disarming himself. Then he started walking toward them. "You've spent your life whispering about a monster, Moss." Caleb said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You've fed him with your rumors and your hate. You wanted to see him. Here I am." Panic seized Pete Dawson. He fumbled for his pistol, but Caleb moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't throw a punch. He slammed his open palm flat against Dawson's chest. The sound was a sickening thud, and Dawson flew backward as if struck by a cannonball, landing in a heap, gasping for air. The second thug drew his weapon, but Caleb was already there. He seized the man's gun arm, his huge hand enveloping it. A sharp cracking sound echoed in the cold air, followed by a high-pitched scream of agony. The man dropped to his knees, cradling a hand that was now a mangled ruin of bone and flesh. It was over in seconds. Two armed men, disabled with brutal, calculated efficiency, without a single killing blow. Sterling Moss stood alone, his face ashen with terror. His world of hired muscle and slick intimidation had just been systematically dismantled. He looked from his moaning men to the giant standing before him, and his nerve shattered. He turned to flee. Moss Caleb's voice was quiet, but it stopped him cold. Caleb walked over, picked up Dawson's fallen pistol, and calmly emptied the chambers, letting the bullets fall uselessly into the snow. He tossed the empty gun aside and looked at Moss with an expression of pure, final contempt. "This is over," Caleb stated. "You will go to Silas Croft, and you will personally burn his marker of debt. You will never set foot in this valley or speak my wife's name again. If I ever see your face again, I promise you I will not be this gentle." He then delivered the ultimate insult. He turned his back on Moss, a complete and utter dismissal, and walked toward the porch where Abigail stood. Her own rifle now lowered her eyes, shining with tears of relief and overwhelming love. He stopped before her, his gaze softening as he looked at her brave, beautiful face. He reached up and gently took the heavy rifle from her grasp. "It's over, Abigail," he said softly. "I'm home." She didn't hesitate. She launched herself from the step and into his arms, burying her face against his strong chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He was her giant, her protector, her Caleb. Behind them, a broken and humiliated Sterling Moss hauled his injured man onto his horse and fled the valley. His power and pride left shattered in the snow. The story he tried to suppress, the true story, spread through Redemption Ridge like a cleansing fire. It wasn't the tale of a monster's rage, but of a husband's controlled and decisive defense of his wife and home. The fear the townspeople held for Caleb Stone began to transform grudgingly at first, then completely into a deep and abiding respect. As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the tranquil valley, Caleb and Abigail stood on their porch. His arm was wrapped securely around her, and her head rested contentedly on his shoulder. The great lonely silence of his past was gone, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of a shared future. The giant had finally found his home not on a patch of land, but in the steadfast, gentle heart of the woman beside him. And so the story of Caleb and Abigail Stone became a quiet legend in the heart of the West. It wasn't a tale of gunslingers or gold strikes, but of something far more rare and precious. It's a powerful reminder that the true measure of a person isn't found in their size, their reputation, or the whispers that follow them. It's found in their heart. Abigail looked past the fearsome giant and saw a gentle soul starved of kindness, while Caleb found in a desperate stranger the courage and love he thought he'd never know. Their story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, and that true strength lies not in brute force, but in the courage to protect, to trust, and to love. If their journey from fear to forever touched your heart, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the wild pages of history.